welcome Dominic and Rebecca on stage. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along. And a special greetings to everyone watching online, including Stephen Jones in Penarth.
Indeed.
At the beginning of Puccini's Tosca, we first hear a theme that will later come to be associated with the Baron Scarpia, who is the chief of police and not a very nice person. And it goes something like this at the very beginning of the opera. And immediately we know that we're in a rather heightened kind of sound world and place. And this is what announces the fact that we're in the middle of an opera and a kind of very particular kind of genre of communication, a kind of hyper one from the very beginning, before the singing has even commenced. And we find this also in operas by Mozart, like The Magic Flute, which begins like this. So another big fanfare, or Beethoven's Fidelio, or Wagner and Meistersinger, or even Strauss's Rosenkavalier. So whichever one it is, there is a sense that there's something very particular about the sound world and the nature of opera that doesn't necessarily remain contained by the style of singing, which is also particular, as we'll see later on. And why am I telling you this? Well, I hear that there was a sporting fixture earlier in the week that led to the song You'll Never Walk Alone, Would You Believe It, trending on social media, and the hashtag YNWA, I can't do that bit, a hashtag trending 80 years after this song was first heard in the musical Carousel. So it's quite easy to forget that because the song has become so associated with football, and not just with Liverpool, I have to say, various European teams have also made it a kind of unofficial anthem. It's easy to forget that actually it belongs to this musical by Rodgers and Hammerstein, Carousel, and that it was sung in that production by an opera singer, Christine Johnson, who we can see here on the right, who the year before had sung the role of Erda in Wagner's Das Rheingold at the Metropolitan Opera, which is pretty hardcore, very difficult opera singing. And I was reminded when I accidentally came across an image of her tombstone that it commemorates the fact that she worked across opera and Broadway and that they were kind of marked out as two separate things. And in fact, at the bottom of her tombstone, she even has, "You'll never walk alone, would you believe it?" which is very sweet. Now, this reminds me of a question that I get asked periodically as a musicologist that works on musical theatre. And it's one, if I'm really honest, that makes me look longingly at the canal. And it's this: what's the difference between an opera and a musical? And the reason that I don't think it's a very useful question is both of those terms refer to genres. And genre doesn't really exist. It's an abstract term that helps us sort of organize works together in a rough sort of way, but neither of them is an actual thing. And therefore, any list we make of the unique features of either is kind of a bit redundant. And so the whole thing needs to be thrown away, something like that. But something that I am more interested in that might not seem immediately compelling, but which actually explains perhaps what You'll Never Walk Alone is about, is this question, which is why would a musical, a Broadway musical, in the commercial theatre, evoke opera through its writing or its production or its casting? Because we're now talking about a specific work from one genre making reference to another genre. What do they mean by that? Why were they doing that? And the answer to the question, in the case of Carousel, could be an operatic subject. In other words, that if you're writing a musical on an operatic subject, then you might write the musical in an operatic kind of way. What do we mean by an operatic subject? Well, let's consider some of the themes that Carousel is about. Violence, redemption, jealousy, flirtation, forgiveness, suicide, gambling. It really is a whole operatic list. And therefore, it has this kind of particular need for a particular kind of musical expression. And someone before Rodgers and Hammerstein agreed that this was an operatic subject, and his name was Puccini, the composer of Tosca and La Bohème and Madame Butterfly. He tried to get the rights to this Hungarian play that was written in 1909 called Lilium to turn it into an opera long before Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote Carousel in 1945. And Ferenc Molnar, the Hungarian playwright who wrote the play, said no, because he said, well, I'm really sorry, but this is a great play by me, and I don't want it to become known as a great opera by Puccini. Although I have a theory that when we compare the photograph of Puccini to the photograph of Molnar, that it might be hat envy. Now, curiously, Molnar gave permission to Rodgers and Hammerstein to turn Lilium into a musical after seeing Rodgers and Hammerstein's first show, Oklahoma, in 1945. And the reason that that's a bit strange, given that the subject matter is operatic, is this quote from Stephen Sondheim, who was the protege of Hammerstein. And he said, Oklahoma is about a picnic, and Carousel is about life and death. In other words, they're about very different kinds of things. So what is it about Oklahoma that made him do this? And I suggest it's that life and death that creates the operatic impulse within this story, and therefore starts to explain what this slightly strange musical, with its very odd plot and often worrying and troubling storyline, and very operatic-sounding music at times, I think that explains what it's all about. So to help us kind of understand what we might mean by operatic, I've invited along one of my absolute favorite opera singers. She has performed in operas by Handel and Strauss and sometimes Benjamin Britten. She won a Grammy Award for her recording of Hansel and Gretel, but she's best known for her assumptions of various roles by Mozart, sometimes playing a countess and sometimes a dinner lady. Please welcome Rebecca Evans CBE. So Rebecca, first of all, welcome to Gresham. Thank you so much for taking part in this event. So obviously your career has mainly been in opera, but your family has a particular connection to musicals of another time, does it not?
Yes, absolutely. You know, I was really blessed. I was born in a tiny little village called Pontrhy-de-Ven in South Wales, the birthplace of Richard Burton and Ivor Emanuel. And my mother was actually in the original Ivor Novello company many, many years ago, and in the original Dolly Cart company, which I think I've probably forgotten to tell you. So
Revelation. Oh my goodness.
I was fortunate to be always surrounded and bathed in beautiful music of all kinds, because my mother was a fantastic soprano herself, and we were brought up with recordings of Joan Sutherland, which I mimicked and could sing along to. But it was her love of Novello and G&S really that she brought into the house, and it really ignited my love of music.
And you started out as a nurse, but you moved into opera. And I was interested to understand, how does someone know that they're an opera singer rather than, another genre of singer? What is it about? I mean, maybe you can only speak to your voice, which is fair enough, but what is it that made you think or understand that that's what it was going to be?
I think I knew from a very early age that my singing voice was very different. I didn't always have a particularly good time in school because my voice stood out and I was mocked because of it. It was very, very focused, louder than anyone else's, and slightly different even at a young age. And it was never... I never felt I was destined for the world of music theatre, although it would have been an absolute pleasure and a joy to have been part of it. But I always knew, and it was burning inside in my heart from a very early age, that actually I wanted to be an opera singer. I wanted to sing these beautiful arias. When I was 11, my father bought me the Carl Byrne recordings of Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni and Magic Flute, and that ignited my love of opera even further.
Oh, that's lovely. And one final question. So this lecture series is called Showstoppers, and we're looking at a particular group of songs that's known for stopping the show dead because of the response to the audience is so visceral that it's impossible to continue. We must stop and applaud because we're so moved. Do we have that kind of thing in opera?
We definitely have it in opera. Not for my voice type, generally, I have to say.
I've seen you stop the show.
Have you?
Yeah.
Perhaps I had an event on stage rather than a vocal event. Anyway, it's usually the tenor, that stops the show. Or the high baritone. You have the incredible arias, the Eritu arias from Ballo in Mascara, and the Nessun Dorma arias from Turandot and Tosca, the Ricondita Armonia, all these beautiful arias that Puccini wrote. And it's usually the tenor that stops the show, I think.
Oh, so loud and heavy.
Loud, heavy, lyrical and gorgeous.
Wonderful. Well, we'll look forward to hearing you sing in a few minutes. In 2025, we're in a very strange cultural landscape regarding opera, whereby English National Opera and Welsh National Opera are on their knees financially, and Glyndebourne touring opera basically no longer exists. So it's curious to consider that back in the middle of the 19th century, in America, opera actually represented power. What do I mean by that? Well, it was kind of the genre of the day, and not just because they were being written then, but it had a very particular popularity in that country, which I find curious because they were very keen to get rid of us in terms of being in charge of them. So they wanted to rid themselves of their colonial legacy when it came to political power, but when it came to culture, the thing that many cities and many states were most engaged with was Italian opera, would you believe? And we can see evidence of this in diaries and accounts in newspapers of the day. So, for example, I found this intriguing quote from 1836 in the New Orleans Bee. And it says, "Operas appear to amuse our citizens more than any other form of public amusement, except for balls." And 15 years after that, in this intriguing diary entry about life in New York in 1851, George Templeton Strong, who was a famous diarist, wrote about how crazy everyone was going about a Bellini opera called La Sonnambula, the Sleepwalker. And he said, "The people are sonnambula mad. Everybody goes, and knob and snob sit side by side fraternally on the hard benches." So there's a sense that actually it's not just for one kind of person, it's for everybody. And it got even more into a frenzy in the 1850s with the arrival of this person who was known as the Swedish Nightingale. It's Jenny Lind. And her career was quite amazing. She started singing professionally in opera at the age of 10, which almost ruined her voice, but she retrained as a teenager, and from the age of 18 onwards, performed leading roles in big operas that most people nowadays would only sing in their 30s. So she was quite extraordinary. She spent 2 seasons here in London and sang in the premiere of Verdi's I Masnadieri at Her Majesty's Theatre, which is currently haunted by Andrew Lloyd Webber. And then in 1849, she quit opera altogether, despite being the big operatic figure in Europe of the day, and was invited by P.T. Barnum, this remarkable entrepreneur in America, to go on a 2-year concert tour of the States. And all of the repertoire was operatic, even though obviously they weren't staging operas. And of course, this is commemorated in the film, or represented in the film, The Greatest Showman, although unfortunately she doesn't actually sing any opera, even though she's still supposed to be an opera singer, something I still don't understand. As is the case with many celebrities, she was also lampooned in the press, and so we can see from this engraving from 1850 that she is being mocked as the real Swedish nightingale, the only specimen in the country. So very quickly, people started to try to find fault with her. But there was a famous book, a major book written in 1851, and it was just the memoirs of this particular writer, Nathaniel Parker Willis. He kind of wrote down everything he remembered, not only about how he felt about hearing Lind in performance, but also the social impact that he observed from her performances. And basically, this was all about how she helped opera to become for the people. And he talks in this passage about it passing into the hands of the people. And he goes on to describe how another company struggled to get 200 or 300 people in, and then suddenly the company moved downtown into the center of New York, and the audiences went up to 2,000 or 3,000, which was a significant percentage of the population of New York back in 1851. And he says, opera music has, in a couple of months, become a popular taste. He then observes this could never have happened in England because they're too keen on the social class system, and so there never would have been the kind of easy sharing of art and culture between the classes over in England that there is in America. But it's a land of opportunity, so therefore we're so equal that everyone can have opera. And he ends with this remarkable comment, which basically says that Jenny Lind was heaven sent. She seems to have been sent by a special providence to make opera the music of the people. Okay. Now, as is often the case when things become for everybody, the older families and the more exclusive classes tried to take back control. So in 1854, the old families in New York all got together and built the first successful attempt to establish an opera company in New York. It was called the Academy of Music. It was not a training place, it was a performance venue. And it was successful for about 30 years. But of course, the nouveau riche were not at all happy that they were not able to buy their way into the boxes. And so they set up a rival company, which is the Metropolitan Opera, which is the opera house that exists today, although it's not actually this building. It moved in the 1960s. And so this was established in 1883, and within a couple of years, that was the end of the Academy of Music. So the Met is going along very happily. And this becomes kind of a subject in the current series, The Gilded Age, by Julian Fellowes on Sky. So this is all going on very happily, and then in 1906, someone else came along and said, hey, I think we should challenge the Metropolitan Opera. We shouldn't allow them to have a monopoly over the genre in New York. So for 5 years, he put so much money into the Manhattan Opera House that the Met started to bleed, not only because no one was going, but because there was a competition. And so the Met was having to spend so much money on running this place that they just couldn't make ends meet. And so they did a deal with him in 1911 and paid him $1.2 million to stop putting on opera in New York so they could be in charge again. Why am I telling you all this? Well, this is the guy that was doing this challenge in 1906, and his name was Oscar Hammerstein I, and he was a cigar maker, actually quite a clever inventor. He invented all kinds of machinery to make cigars, and he built theatres both in the States and actually here in London. The site of the Peacock Theatre here in London was originally an Oscar Hammerstein I theatre. So this creates our link, in a way, to Oscar Hammerstein II, who wrote Carousel. The point being that it's not ridiculous that the grandson of this person who challenged the Metropolitan Opera in the early 20th century would write this operatic musical in 1945. And it meant that Hammerstein and Rodgers, who was his composer, both knew how opera could be for the people and very popular, as Jenny Lind was, but also it allowed them to nudge musicals in a more highbrow direction, so they could have their cake and eat it. And it worked very well for them, this kind of formulation, if you like, because when we just look at a list of their remarkable output, most of their musicals written over this 16-year period were phenomenally successful, and things that we're still familiar with today, things that are still put on commercially today. And apart from the two that are underlined, Allegro and Me and Juliet, one of the features of these shows is that they tended to be adaptations of pre-existing material. So one of the other ways in which Rodgers and Hammerstein tried to make things a bit more highbrow was by taking on established literary texts, particularly plays and novels and short stories that were already seen as a little bit more highbrow, and they hoped that by taking on more serious stories, they could benefit from that association. The success of their career can be seen very quickly from two television events in the 1950s, which was the age of the television in America. It was the period where everyone bought a television, basically. On March the 28th, 1954, a 2-hour special of Rodgers and Hammerstein songs, mostly sung by the people who did them in the original productions, was broadcast on all 4 main television networks, simultaneously live in America. So it took over the nation in the way that a royal wedding would, or a major funeral. And then 3 years later, they kind of did it again and wrote a television version of Cinderella for Julie Andrews that was allegedly watched by 107 million people, which would have been about 2/3 of the population of the country at that point. So you can see that they were something special. As I said, these shows tended to be based on existing texts, and this is a high-tech, very high-quality photograph of me with Oscar Hammerstein's copy of Lilium, the play on which the show is based. But it reminds us that he really did read through the thing a lot of times. And it's worth briefly trying to understand what it was about the impact of that play that might have attracted them when they were looking to write something a bit more highbrow, something a bit more operatic. And this review from the New York Times of the 1921 revival of the play tells us that Lilium lets us look into the soul of a dirty bum, lets you follow it beyond the grave and back to earth again, and leaves you uplifted. At times, a cathedral hush settles over the play for those out front who have a prayer in their hearts. So this is quite serious stuff for something that's just a play. So what's all of this about? Let's think about this song, You'll Never Walk Alone, and where it's coming in Carousel. So what's Carousel about? Well, in the original play, it's about people living in Budapest, but Rodgers and Hammerstein moved the action to New England, and they made it about a carousel barker, Billy Bigelow, who meets a mill worker called Julie Jordan, and they fall in love and get married very rapidly, but he can't get work, and so he becomes very unhappy. There's a lot of social tension going on around them, and he considers leaving Julie, and he also, at one point, is reported to have beat her, although we don't see this on stage, so all we see is the emotional impact of that. But it immediately takes us into a very serious kind of subject matter compared to Oklahoma and the other kinds of stories we would have seen on Broadway before. So Billy learns that Julie is pregnant, and he decides, instead of trying to get a job, he decides to commit a burglary. He's tempted by an evil Mephistophelian friend to try and hold someone up, basically, and grab several $1,000s from them. However, they get caught in the act. His friend runs away, but Billy is caught. And he's about to be arrested, but doesn't want to go to prison for 10 or 15 years. He wants his freedom, so he decides to commit suicide, which is the scene that we can see there. He dies, and then over his body, Julie tries to sing a song that she sang as a young girl, a song of comfort, which turns out to be You'll Never Walk Alone, but she can't get through it. And therefore her cousin Nettie Fowler, with whom she lives, sings it for her. And this was the role sung by the opera singer. In the original outline of the show from Hammerstein's papers, we can see that they very quickly had the idea that this was going to be a moment for a song, even though there is no such moment really in the play. So there's no kind of praying over his body or anything like that, really. And we can see it's referred to in this outline as having a lullaby quality. And Nettie, or Hollander as she was called in this original version, holds Julie on her lap and sings the song. So here is the song, and we're going to perform it now. Here they are. Marvelous. So we can see the impact of this song is very particular at this very bleak moment in the story, and the story is not over yet. Let's think about the song then. So for some of Rodgers and Hammerstein's songs, we have quite a lot of manuscript material, but for this particular song, all we appear to have is what we call a fair copy of the song. In other words, Rodgers has written out the piano part and the vocal line with the words above it, and it looks a bit like this, very neatly written out, and it's interesting to see it. But the thing that intrigues me the most about it, actually, is that it matches almost exactly what's published in the vocal score and in professional song sheets for this song. And while that might not seem like a big deal, it actually is quite unusual in the Broadway repertoire, because people like Cole Porter or Irving Berlin would either not write out their music at all or would write very simple accompaniments. So it feels like Rodgers means something very particular in having this material laid out in this kind of way. In terms of what the song might be about, it might be stating the obvious, but the reviews said things like, "You'll Never Walk Alone" is almost a hymn, which is interesting because there's no religious setting or kind of really religious person in the story. But it did remind me that when I opened Hammerstein's research files for Carousel at the Library of Congress last year, the first thing I happened to come across was this photograph of some kind of chapel or perhaps church in New England that he used to help himself understand what this story might have been about. So it does make sense that there's something religious going on there, and it strikes me that it might be an allusion to the Bach, Gounod, Ave Maria, or this kind of song whereby the accompaniment reminds me a bit. And the vocal line similarly sort of gradually rises up and up as the thing becomes more and more kind of despairing and asking for more. It's interesting reading reviews of the show and kind of promotional material around it. It seems like one thing that Rodgers wanted to get across was the idea that the thing that persuaded him to turn Lilium into a musical was that he suddenly had an idea for how the music in general should sound. He said, not the actual notes, but the colour of it and the thought, which is the kind of discussion that we find actually in Verdi's correspondence around Italian opera. So again, there is this perhaps connection with that kind of thing. And in terms of what Hammerstein said it might have been about, well, he was asked in letters periodically what he meant by the song You'll Never Walk Alone. And I found this curious one written to the Reverend Edward Upson Cowles of the First Congregational Church in Worthington, Massachusetts. And he said, it's difficult for me to add anything. Basically, the words mean what you think that they do, but you could substitute hope with faith or with God. So there is a sense here of maybe the key to why this became successful as a kind of praying song without explicit religious imagery. The great discussion, though, within the reviews of Carousel when it opened is, what is it? So, for example, the journal American said it's romance, it's comedy, it's melodrama, and it's metaphysical, whatever it means by that. And in the Herald Tribune, Otis L. Guernsey Jr. said that Carousel proved that music and real drama can be combined outside the opera. So he's actually talking about something in this show that is bringing operatic values and aesthetics to it, even if it's not itself an opera. And we have to note that the title of this review is Definitely Something, i.e., I don't know what it is, but it's definitely something. The Daily News said, I don't know just what to call it, and Time magazine said it is not a musicomedy. And this stuff goes back to the very first reactions to the show in the press in Boston, where they previewed it earlier in April 1945. And Eliot Norton, who was one of the big critics of the day, said, it's not so much a musical comedy as a musical play, and a perfected version of it, containing all the emotional power of fine drama, heightened by the aural splendors of beautiful music, would come very close to being a new dramatic art form. But then he adds, very strangely, Wagner aimed at something like this. So I think what he's basically saying is it's kind of trying to be an opera, but not quite an opera. And it continues even in this article called The Second Chance from the Saturday Review of Literature. This article also focuses on the thing that's troubling about this story, or one of the things that's troubling about this story that I alluded to earlier, i.e. the fact that the main character hits his wife off stage. And he explains what happens later in the story. So he talks about the fact that in the final scene of the play, the Budapest barker returns to Earth, having died, and strikes his daughter, having struck her mother. So it becomes more disturbing as it goes along. And he's trying to say that this sense of it being disturbing is actually what makes this thing an interesting and powerful piece, even though it's troubling. So what's this all about? We left Julie and Nettie singing You'll Never Walk Alone over the dead body of Billy Bigelow. And what happens after that is that he gets greeted by a heavenly friend who takes him to the back garden of heaven. But of course, he gets told by the star keeper, who polishes the stars every night so that they look shiny up there. That's my astronomy lecture for the year. He gets told by the star keeper, we won't let you in because you're not sorry for all these dreadful things you've done, and you're a terrible person, and everyone thinks that you're a terrible person. All the people that know you think that you're awful, and why are you not sorry? And then he says, you have an opportunity for a second chance. You can go back to Earth for one day and do something good for someone else for once. And he goes, oh, go on then. And he decides to steal one of the stars, and he takes it down to Earth to meet his daughter, who, of course, he's never met because Julie was pregnant at the point when he committed suicide. But because time up there is different than time down here, 15 years have elapsed, and she's now 15. He then has a chat with her and scares her and offers her a star, which is indeed a scary thing to be offered. And she rejects it and wonders what on earth is going on. And so he hits her hand, and it's the only time we actually see him do that kind of thing in the show. And she's very surprised because he's a ghost, and therefore she doesn't actually feel anything. So it's a very curious moment dramaturgically. So he's ruined his second chance because that was his opportunity to do good. But Rodgers and Hammerstein add an extra scene that isn't in the play, whereby Billy Bigelow then gets to see the high school graduation of his daughter, Louise. And we can see in the bottom right-hand corner that he's whispering in the ear of his wife, "Believe the words that you're hearing." And everyone is singing, "You'll never walk alone," for a second time. So what he's basically trying to do to redeem himself is to say, you need to live your life kind of unharmed by me now. You need to let go all of these negative associations, because they've just been sitting through a speech in which they're told, the young people are told, don't be defined by your parents, define your own life. So there's a sense, which is controversial, but also actually ambiguous, that perhaps he might have redeemed himself after all, but it's not clear. People do find this very troubling, understandably. And a famous example where someone responded to it in this way was an article in New York magazine from 2011, when there was a discussion by leading literary figures, and they were talking about what's your favorite musical, what's the greatest musical of all time. And Frank Rich, who's a famous theatre critic over there, says, "I love Carousel." And Nora Ephron, who is well known as a screenwriter of films like When Harry Met Sally, said, "Yes, but you're a boy." And so we're getting into the fact that not everyone responds to it in the same way. And yet, there is something about this particular show that seems to have become more revered as time goes on, in the way that other pieces perhaps have become a bit less revered. So how do we explain what's going on here? Well, I came across this quote from Nicholas Heitner, who directed a famous production of Carousel at the National Theatre in 1992, and he talks about what's curious about the show. He says, there's a very interesting tension between the sweetness of the music and the powerful sexual undercurrents of the play. So he's talking about opposites, kind of aesthetic opposites, and how they collide with very strange and extreme plot points. So I was trying to think of a way to communicate what this might be alluding to, and thinking back to the operatic associations of this story and of the music. And the best way I could think of to explain what it might mean is this concept of the sublime, which is actually very complicated and too complicated to explain in depth. But it comes from this 18th century idea that great art can be painful and depict terror. And through that terror comes a kind of beauty. And someone that wrote about this famously was Edmund Burke in 1757. He says, whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the idea of pain and danger, whatever is in any sort terrible or conversant about terrible objects, and so on and so forth, is a source of the sublime. So it's not sublime in the way that we use it colloquially now. And he says it's productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. So the horror that we feel upon hearing this beautiful music and these awful things going on in the story may get us in the direction of understanding why Carousel is still around, despite being about something that we can probably all agree is not very nice. And he goes on to say, actually, pain, when it refers to death, it becomes even more painful. And so he kind of ramps up the idea that when we start talking about death or seeing art, seeing death represented in art, then that's when art is at its most terrible. And the person that's particularly famous for turning this into art is J.M.W. Turner, the artist, with his famous paintings of nature challenging man. For example, this one of the mouth of the River Humber shows a ship in peril, and we can see the poor men on the ship are possibly about to meet their death. In the horizon, we can see things are calm. We'd like to be on land with them or in the port, but instead, we can see the ship is in peril. But at the front of the painting is the worst bit of all, that the sea is most turbulent at the front, which means that we are standing in the most peril, and therefore, the more we stare at the painting, the more terror we feel, perhaps. And it gets even worse with this later painting that he did of a snowstorm, where you can see there's a kind of vortex that this poor ship is being sucked into, but at the same time, we're in the middle of the snowstorm as the viewers of the painting. Or to look at a different kind of subject matter, here's the Houses of Parliament burning in 1834, and you can see that as the flames grow, the bridge is gradually burning, and the burning is coming towards us. So this kind of terror is something that we're used to seeing in opera, whether it's the Ring Cycle with its horrendous stories of what Wotan gets up to, or Il Trovatore with a story of the gypsy who throws her baby in the fire before the story's even begun, or these kinds of scenes of nature overwhelming man. Why would Rodgers and Hammerstein want to write this kind of piece at this moment? Well, it was 1945, the war wasn't quite over, and there was all kind of psychological impact going on at this time. It wasn't just the fact that people were dying and that people at home were suffering, but the psychological impact of the people, the ordinary people who'd gone to war to fight, was massive. And we learned that 40% of medical discharges from the American army during the war were for psychiatric conditions because they were so disturbed about what they'd been asked to do. So it was a time when these sorts of very difficult questions were being asked of society, and we see it in other kinds of art of the same moment. So, for example, 2 months after the premiere of Carousel on Broadway, here in England, was the premiere of Benjamin Britten's Peter Grimes, which is also about a main character who's an outsider, who is very poor, works in a fishing community, does not take care of the lives of others, is violent, leads to the death of others. He dies at the end, but there's a controversial suggestion that he's redeemed through the love of Ellen Orford. So there's definite overlaps. There's something in the air about whose life matters and what are the prices of peace and freedom. So if we bring all of this together, we start with this operatic plot. And in context, it's a dramatic high point written for an opera singer with its connotations of cultural hierarchy that allow Rodgers and Hammerstein to place themselves perhaps in a more highbrow artistic position. And at the same time, it's a prayer without the language of religion. So it's transcendent in the dramatic moment. And then finally, it contains all this violence, terror, contemplation of death, leading perhaps to this sense of something like the sublime, with the wartime context leading to these questions of whose life matters and who deserves redemption. How bad does what you have done have to be in order for you to be redeemable and forgiven? Beyond Carousel, of course, the song, as we saw at the beginning, has had an afterlife. It was covered by people like Doris Day and Elvis Presley, and most famously by Jerry and the Pacemakers in 1963, whose recording was played for 4 weeks in a row at Liverpool before the match started, and that's what led to that becoming such a popular anthemic theme for them, and they eventually incorporated it into their coat of arms that you can see there on the bottom. But the song has also been used a lot in America in particular for fundraising drives for charity, and it's also reappeared periodically as a song of comfort in times of mourning, and I had forgotten. But at the end of March 2020, it actually charted at #1, about 10 days into the first lockdown. So Jerry and the Pacemakers were at #1 again. And that led to various artists, including Marcus Mumford and Captain Tom, doing their own cover versions because the song was around again a lot. Now, I do like to end these lectures with another song, and I was reminded that this wasn't the only time that Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote a big song for an opera singer. Another example would be Some Enchanted Evening from South Pacific, written in 1949 for Ezio Pinza, the great bass of the Metropolitan Opera. But more analogous to You'll Never Walk Alone is a song that was written for The Sound of Music on Broadway in 1959 for this person, Patricia Neway, who was also an opera singer. And to close the first act of the show, she, as the Reverend Mother, had to sing an uplifting song to the young Maria to persuade her to go back and look after the children. And here is the very first sketch that I found of Rodgers' melody for the song, which then he turned into a more harmonized version, and it is, of course, Climb Every Mountain. So here to end, we're going to do Climb Every Mountain. Please welcome back Rebecca.
your dreams, a dream that will need all the love you can give. Every day of your life